I'm Scott Borders, and this is oil painting from start to finish. This week's painting is of three little piglets from Vermont at a fair that I visited 3 or 4 years ago. I call it Vermont Pigs. Beginning a new painting that I call Vermont Pigs. If you haven't watched the color mixing video, I recommend that because you'll see how I mix the major color groups. I'm going to start drawing this. I like the composition of this photograph. I've actually moved things around a bit in Photoshop to achieve this. I'm going to not paint that pig in the upper background. That's distracting. And you'll see how I simplify a little bit in the foreground as well. There's kind of an extra ear you might see in the photograph that shouldn't be there. And that's because I'd moved this pig in the foreground up because I liked it better. So I'm going to begin by thinking about the major masses, the major shapes, and where they are. So I see this pig is right about in here. Lighten that some. I'm using raw umber and a good paint thinner. And by a good paint thinner, I mean one that's formulated to work with oil paints, not simply something cheap you might get to clean out your brushes. I use an odorless paint thinner. I use an odorless paint thinner. I'm beginning a new painting today that I call Vermont Pigs. I love the arrangement of these pigs. I've helped the arrangement in Photoshop. The pig in the lower part, the larger one in the lower part of the photograph, I've actually moved up from a different position. And I love the interplay of the ears and the way the colors work there. I'm going to not paint that pig in the upper foreground, or background I mean, the one that would be up here. I'm just going to simplify the composition a little bit. You'll also notice that there's an extra ear in the foreground that's from a pig that I covered up, and of course I won't paint that ear. So I'm going to think about the major shapes and the placement and not care about details just yet. So if I start this larger pig right about here, and where does it go down to? It goes down to right about here. And I want to make sure I get that angle of his face there and just paint a nice curve. Probably needs to come down just a little bit lower. So the one that's leaning on him starts right about here or so. And his face doesn't come quite halfway over. His ears right about in here. Drawing is all about mapping. Where are things in relationship to the canvas? Where is everything else in relationship to everything else? I'll probably comes up a little too high there. When I make corrections, I like to rub out the things that don't belong there. You can end up with a kind of a mess that's confusing. One thing I'm paying attention to as I rough in the shapes and placement of our pigs is to think about negative spaces. What are the shapes of those negative spaces as they surround the objects that I'm painting? And that helps me kind of keep things straight. I'm going to grab a little larger brush and just start to indicate some of the shading, some of the masses. Very thin paint here because I'm going to want to paint over it with the right color. A little closer. And there's a bit of a black pig in the foreground here that I'm not going to put in. Pay attention to these angles as I do that. Notice what I'm doing here is moving the ear back. I notice that this part of the face seems short, but this is in the right place, so that means that ear is a little too far forward. There, it's better. Okay. So I'm putting in enough detail just to help me not have to think about it so much later on. There's always some correction I find in the drawing as I get going with colors, but I like to minimize that by taking my time now. Okay. And we'll take a little break before we continue.